Get the Grandmaster norm, Game 1. The idea of this tape is to present Grandmaster games annotated in depth in order that you can compare your skill with theirs. After you have been given the opening move, you'll be asked to switch off and start guessing the moves of one of the players. In this game you play black. According to the accuracy and depth of each answer, you will score a number of points. Write your move and score on the score sheet provided. At the end of the game, you should add up your points and compare the result with the grading given. This game features the battle of youth versus age. Your partner with the black pieces is the young Soviet Grandmaster, Rafael Vahanyan, who has figured among the prize winners in a number of important tournaments recently. Your opponent is the veteran American Grandmaster, Samuel Reshevsky, who in the 1940s and 1950s fought with the leading Russians for the World Championship. The opening began 1. White pawn to e4, black pawn to e6, 2. White pawn to d4, black pawn to d5. Here white played 3, knight to d2, guarding the e-pawn and avoiding the pin by black bishop to b4. Now black attacks the e-pawn a second time by knight to f6. On his fourth move, white pushed on with pawn to e5, attacking the black knight. The knight retreated to d7, and the next few moves see white trying to support his centre, whilst black tries to increase pressure on it. The game continued. 5. White pawn to f4, black pawn to c5, 6. White pawn to c3, black knight to c6, 7. White knight on d2 to f3, black queen to a5. White now played a curious move, 8, king to f2. It is well motivated, however. White wants to recapture on d4 with a pawn, which would be impossible at the moment because of the pin by the black queen. Also, the danger attack on the white king should be minimal because of the block position. On his 8th move, black developed his bishop to e7, and white replied by 9, bishop to d3. Switch off now and guess black's 9th move. Switch on again when you have made your choice. Black played 9, queen to b6. Take 4 points if you found this move. In the present position, we have an illustration of one of the main problems in opening theory. Namely, what weight should a player give to considerations of development as opposed to the specific demands of a particular position? Let me explain. The opening variation chosen by white has the object of maintaining a central pawn wedge and a large space advantage. In many games, white achieves just this very idea, the consequence being that black lost after making seemingly natural moves. In this variation, then, we can say that mere development is not enough. Immediate measures must be taken against the white pawn centre. The black queen was handily placed on a5 only if the white king had stayed at e1. Then there would have been pressure on the white d-pawn, the c-pawn being pinned. Now the white king has moved, and given time would find a safe haven on g2. 9, black queen to b6, threatens to win the d-pawn, and straightaway exploits the vulnerable position of the white king. Taking into consideration what has just been said, 9, black castles, instead of black queen to b6, would be answered by 10, white pawn to g3, providing a safe square for the white king on g2. No points for that move. We place the white pawn on g2, the black king on e8, and the black rook on h8. Take 1 point for 9, black pawn to b5, with the Niemann-Vickian idea of attacking the base of the white pawn chain at c3. 1 point also if you chose 9, black pawn to b6, with the idea of developing the black bishop at a6. If black had intended either of these two plans, it would have been better to play them last move. In response to 9, black queen to b6, white guarded the queen pawn with 10, white knight to e2. Switch off and try to guess black's next move. Black played 10, pawn to f6. Take 3 points for this move. It is in fact fully in accordance with what has already been said about the need to attack the white pawn centre. Specifically, black intends to win a pawn by 12, black pawn takes pawn on d4, 13, white pawn takes pawn on d4, black pawn takes pawn on e5, 14, white pawn on f4 takes pawn, black knight on d7 takes pawn on e5, taking advantage of the fact that the d-pawn is pinned. Switch off and set up the pieces as in diagram A. White bishop to e3 is out of the question, as the pawn on b2 would then be en prise. And 11, white pawn takes pawn on c5, loses the e-pawn after black bishop takes pawn on c5 check. Take 1 bonus point if you saw these two lines. Return to diagram A and move the black pawn from f6 to f7. Again, 10 castles scores nothing for the reasons mentioned in the last note. White has the time to play pawn to g3 and king to g2. 10, black pawn to g5, however, nets you 2 points. Black strikes at the centre and intends to win a pawn by 11, pawn to g4. If white plays 11, white pawn takes pawn on g5, then black can win the valuable central pawn by 11, pawn takes pawn on d4, 12, white pawn takes pawn on d4, black knight takes pawn on e5. Return to diagram A and set up the pieces as shown. After black's move in the game, one way, albeit a not very satisfactory one, for white to release the tension in the centre would be by 11, white queen to b3, offering the exchange of queens. If you had not considered this line before, switch off and guess how black might continue. A game between Kostro and the East German Grandmaster Ullmann went 11, Black queen takes queen on b3. 12. White pawn takes queen on b3. Black pawn takes pawn on d4. White pawn takes pawn on d4. Black castles. 14. White bishop to d2. And now black played pawn to g5 with the subsequent destruction of the white centre. Take 2 bonus points if you considered 11. White queen to b3, and envisage the correct continuation. 1 point if you found the line after a little prompting. Switch off and set up the pieces as in diagram A. White answered the threat to his e-pawn. By 11, pawn takes pawn on f6. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black recaptured the pawn on f6 with his bishop. Take 2 points for this move. Black intends to win the queen pawn with check. By 12, black pawn takes pawn on d4. 13, white pawn takes pawn on d4. Black knight takes pawn on d4. 14, white knight on e2 takes knight on d4. Bishop takes knight on d4 check. 15, white knight takes bishop on d4. Black queen takes knight on d4 check. Return to diagram A. Replace the black pawn on f6 with the white pawn on e5. Here you could have played 11. Black pawn takes pawn on f6. Despite the fact that this move flies in the face of the previous remarks about putting pressure on the white centre pawn, you get 1 point. The threat of black pawn to e5 is difficult for white to meet. Return to diagram A. Remove the white pawn from e5 and replace the black pawn on f6 with the bishop on e7. White's 12th move was the rather bizarre king to g3. Black answered by 12. Pawn takes pawn on d4, and white recaptured. Pawn takes pawn on d4. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black replied by 13 castles. 1 point for this move. Deduct 6 points for the sequence. 13, black knight takes pawn on d4. 14, white knight takes knight on d4. Black bishop takes knight on d4. White knight takes bishop on d4. Black queen takes knight on d4. Black will lose his queen after 16, white bishop to g6 check. Definitely a trap to watch out for in your games. Reset the pieces as in diagram B. Replace the black king on e8 and the black rook on h8. No score for 13, black knight to b4, which is always answered by white bishop to b1, intending immediately to drive the black knight away by pawn to a3. Set up the pieces as in diagram B, switching off if necessary. White's 14th move was rook to e1. Switch off and guess black's reply. Black played the spectacular 14, pawn to e5. Takes 6 points for this move. Perhaps I will not be giving too much away if I tell you that this is only the first of a series of brilliant moves. So think aggressively from now on. If you have not seen this last move by black, then stop now and try to analyze its ramifications. There are plenty of points to be gained in the ensuing variations. Replace the black pawn on e6. It is rather difficult to think of a worthwhile plan apart from the move chosen by Vahanyan. 2 points can be gained by the idea black pawn to g6, followed by black bishop to g7, and the redeployment of the black knight on f6. It is possible that in some lines the knight might go to h5 and put pressure on the f pawn. Indeed, if white on his 14th move had played his rook to f1 instead of e1, then this would have been the best course. 2 points if you had planned to answer 14, white rook to f1 in this way. Nothing for other moves. 14, black queen to c7, intending black pawn to g5, could be adequately met by 15, white pawn to h4. Return to diagram B. Move the white rook from h1 to e1 and the black pawn from e6 to e5. On his 15th move, white took the pawn on e5 with his f-pawn. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black played 15, knight on d7, takes pawn on e5. 1 point. Nothing for other moves. It is essential to take with the knight on d7 rather than the one on c6 in order to open the diagonal of the black-white squared bishop. Take a bonus point if you notice that when white played 16, knight takes knight on e5, he loses to 16, bishop takes knight on e5 check, 17, white pawn takes bishop on e5, black queen to f2 mate. This last line clearly illustrates the advantages of the black bishop on c8 covering the squares d4 and h3. Set up the position as in diagram C. Switch off if necessary. White took the knight on e5 with his d-pawn. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black played the very imaginative 16, bishop to h4 check. Take 5 points for this move. Take 1 point for 16, black knight takes pawn on e5. Although black has a few attacking prospects, 17, white knight to f4 ought to be an adequate defence. Again, as the position is razor sharp, alternatives do not score points. Replace the white knight on e2, the white pawn on e5, and the black knight on c6. Here, for instance, if black played 16, bishop takes pawn on e5 check, white can reply 17, bishop to f4, and escape scot-free. Return to diagram C. Replace the black knight on e5 with the white pawn on d4. Move the black bishop on f6 to h4. White played the forced 17, king takes bishop on h4. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black played the last in a series of stunning sacrifices. 17, rook takes knight on f3. Take 4 points for this move. A further 2 points if you realise that this was one gift which could not be accepted by Olszewski. After 18, pawn takes rook on f3, black queen to f2 check, 19, white king to g5, black pawn to h6 check, 20, white king to f4, black pawn to g5 is checkmate. Return the white king to h4 and the black pawns to g7 and h7. Here white could play 19, white knight to g3, but it's mate all the same. After 19, black queen takes pawn on h2 check, 20, white king to g5, black queen to h6. Return to diagram D and play rook takes knight on f3. Olszewski, still a piece up and unwilling to commit harakiri, guided against the queen check on f2 by 18, white rook to f1. Switch off and guess black's continuation. Black played 19, queen to b4 check, forcing 20, white bishop to f4. If 20, white knight to f4, then black queen to e7 check, 21, white king to h5, black queen takes pawn on e5 check, 22, white king to h4, black queen to f6 check, 23, white king to h5, black queen to h6 is mate. Take 2 bonus points for seeing this line. Return to diagram D, place the white bishop on f4 and the white rook on f1. Replace the black queen on b4 and place the black rook on f3. In this position, black checked again with 20, queen to e7, and after the forced reply, 21, bishop to g5, played black queen to e6, intending mate on either g4 or h3. Take 1, 2 or 3 points according to how many moves of the above sequence you saw. Return to diagram D and play rook takes knight on f3. Move the white rook from e1 to f1. Take 3 points here also. For 18, black queen to d8 check. 19, white bishop to g5. Black queen to d7, which is just as effective as a game continuation. Both of these lines ensure that black regains his piece, always an important consideration in over-the-board play. Return to diagram D, move the white rook from e1 to f1, play black rook takes knight and f3. Deduct 2 points for 19, black knight takes pawn and e5, which loses after 20, white rook takes rook and f3, black knight takes rook and f3 check, 21, white king to g3, and the king returns to safety. Return to diagram D, move the white rook from e1 to f1, play rook takes knight and f3. If you first exchange rooks by 19, black rook takes rook and f1, 20, white queen takes rook and f1, and only then played black knight takes pawn and e5, you get 1 point. With the white king still in no man's land, the black position has compensations for the piece minus. Of course, this line is nothing like as good as a game continuation. Set up the pieces as in diagram E, switch off if necessary. Reshevsky now found the only answer to the threats facing his king. He jettisoned the material by 21, white bishop to f5. One feels that he is extremely lucky to have this resource. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black took the bishop on f5 with his rook. 1 point. Deduct 4 points for 21. Black queen takes bishop on f5, which loses a rook after 22. White queen takes pawn on d5 check. Black bishop to e6. 23. White queen takes rook on f3. Return to diagram E. Remove the white bishop from d3 and place the black rook on f5. As black still threatens to finish the game immediately, by 22, rook takes rook on f1, and 23, black queen to g4 mate. Reshevsky played 22, white knight to f4. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black took the pawn on e5 with his queen. 1 point. Vahanyan's position is now immensely superior. Take a bonus point if you saw that 23, white rook to e1, fails against black rook takes knight and f4 check, and 23, white queen to e1, the black rook takes bishop on g5. Deduct as many points as you see fit if you failed to notice that your queen was en prise. On his 23rd move, Reshevsky warded off the threat to his bishop on g5 by moving his queen to g4. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black played 23, rook to f7. 2 points for this move. 1 point for 23, black bishop to d7. 1 point for 23, black rook to f8. Nothing for any move which allows white to play 24, rook on a1 to e1, followed by rook to e8 check. Deduct 2 points for the mistake, 23, black pawn to h6, which allows 24, bishop takes pawn on h6, considerably complicating black's task. White answered the attack on his queen by 24, queen to h5. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black tried the tricky 24, knight to e7, 3 points. This complicated move must have been rather annoying for Reshevsky, who was in severe time trouble at this stage of the game. The black knight is brought across immediately to attack the white king. One bonus point if you perceive that the clever 25, white queen takes rook on f7 check, black king takes queen, 26, white knight to d3, discovered check, proves to be not very clever after black knight to f5 check. A handy intermediary move which destroys all white's fond illusions about winning the black queen. Return to the position in diagram F. Switch off if necessary. Take a further 2 points if you noted that 25, white bishop takes knight on e7, loses to black rook takes knight on f4 check, white rook takes black rook on f4, black queen takes rook on f4 check, white pawn to g4, black queen takes pawn on h2 check, 28, white king to g5, black pawn to h6 check, 29, white king to g6, black queen to c2 check, with white losing his queen to begin with. Set up the pieces as in diagram F, switching off if necessary. Return the black knight to c6. There are a number of other moves which score points here. 2 points for black knight to d4 with the same threat as in the game. Black knight to f5 check. 2 points for 24, black pawn to h6, which wins the bishop, which is slightly more method than the game continuation. Again 1 point for black bishop to d7, with the idea of doubling rooks on the f-file. Return to diagram F and set up the pieces as shown. Reshevsky guard against a knight check on f5 by playing white pawn to g4. Black instead chose the square g6 to check with his knight. 2 points for this move. Vahanyan takes advantage of the knight's immunity from capture to force the white king to an even more unfavourable position. 26, white knight takes knight on g6 would of course be answered by black queen takes pawn on h2 mate, a recurring theme in this game. You place the white knight on f4 and the white pawn on h2. Place a black knight on g6 and return the black queen to e5. Take an extra point here if you plan to answer 26, white king to h3 by black rook takes knight on f4. When a recapture by the white bishop or rook loses the white queen, as you can easily work out for yourself. Return to diagram F and play white pawn to g4. Deduct 4 points if you played a move overlooking that white was really threatening 26. White queen takes rook on f7 check. Black king takes queen. 27, white knight to d3 discovered check. Black knight to f5 check. White rook takes knight on f5 check. And the black queen is lost whichever way black recaptures. Set the pieces up as in diagram F. Play white pawn to g4, black knight to g6 check. White played 26, king to g3. Switch off and guess black's next move. Black developed finely, and all the more effectively for that, his bishop on d7. With white completely helpless, Bahanyan has all the time in the world to leisurely complete his mobilization. 1 point for this. Nothing else readily springs to mind. White attacked the black queen with 27, rook on a1 to e1, to which black responded by retreating his queen to d6. White in time table played 28, bishop to h6. Switch off and guess black's next move. He played 28, rook on a8 to f8, brutally underlining the pressure on the white knight. 2 points. 1 point for capturing the bishop on h6. This move is less sadistic than that of the game. Doubling rooks demonstrates you have the killer instinct necessary for top-line chess. At this point, Reshevsky lost on time. It scarcely matters. He has a dreadful position with disaster on f4 facing him next move. Now add up your points and write the result on the bottom of your score sheet. Do not be too discouraged if you scored rather poorly in this game. Its sharp nature allowed little room for error, and the brilliance and difficulty of the combinations was unusual, even for a Grandmaster game. End of Game 1. Get the Grandmaster norm, Game 2. Throughout this game you play the white pieces. Your partner is Dr. Max Erver, former world champion and present president of the International Chess Federation. Your opponent is the late Swedish Grandmaster Stoltz. The game was played at the Hastings Christmas Tournament of 1931-32. The opening was the Tarrasch defence to the Queen's Gambit. Whereas the last game was basically imaginative and a test of your tactical power, this time your ability to build an advantageous position and technically exploit a material advantage will be at issue. The opening moves to the game were 1. White pawn to d4, black pawn to d5. 2. White pawn to c4. Black pawn to e6. 3. White knight to c3. Black pawn to c5. This opening, championed by the great German player Tarrasch, seeks to obtain active piece play in return for a central isolated pawn. In response to criticism of this line, Tarrasch rarely remarked, "Only time will tell who is correct, I or the chess world." So far, theory has not given a definite answer, though no grandmaster has championed the black side for any length of time. Over continued with the sharpest counter to the system, the fianchetto of the king's bishop. The game went 4. White pawn takes pawn on d5. Black pawn takes pawn on d5. White knight to f3. Black knight to c6. 6. White pawn to g3. Black knight to f6. 7. White bishop to g2. Black bishop to g4. Now switch off and guess white's 8th move. White played 8, knight to e5. 2 points for picking this move. It sets a little trap. If black over-eagerly plays knight takes pawn on d4, then white gains a piece by 9. Knight takes bishop on g4. Black knight takes knight on g4. 10. White pawn to e3, attacking both black knights. Set up the pieces as in diagram A. Switch off if necessary. Deduct 1 point for 8 castles, which really is the best that black could have hoped for. After 8, black bishop takes knight on f3. 9. White bishop takes bishop on f3. Black knight takes pawn on d4. Black has gained a pawn and threatens to capture white's valuable light-squared bishop. 10. White queen to a4 check can be answered by black queen to d7, and after white queen takes queen on d7 check, black king takes queen on d7. 12. White bishop takes pawn on d5. Black knight takes bishop on d5. 13. White knight takes knight on d5. Black knight takes pawn on e2 check. Black still remains a pawn ahead, with much the better position. Now set up the pieces as in diagram A. Switch off if necessary. No points for 8. White bishop to g5. Black can reply 8. bishop takes knight on f3. 9. White bishop takes bishop on f3. Black knight takes pawn on d4. And now white has the choice of capturing on d5 with the bishop or the knight. If he plays 10, white knight takes pawn on d5. Then he loses a piece to black knight takes bishop on f3 check. 11. White pawn takes knight on f3. Black queen takes knight on d5. A neat way of breaking the pin. If he captures with the bishop, replace the pieces if you move them. The black queen on d8, the knight on d4, and the pawn on d5. Replace the white knight on c3, the bishop on f3, and the pawn on e2. Now play white bishop takes pawn on d5. Black can simply go bishop to e7, since he is not afraid of bishop takes pawn on b7. Black rook to b8, regaining the pawn at b2. Return to diagram A and set up the pieces as shown. Take 1 point for 8. White bishop to e3. This move does defend the d-pawn, but after 8, black pawn takes pawn on d4. White knight takes pawn on d4. Black bishop to e7. Black can develop normally. Return to diagram A and set up the pieces again. Another alternative which gains you 1 point is white pawn takes pawn on c5. Black can achieve a reasonable game by either the simple black bishop takes pawn on c5 or the more complicated 8, black pawn to d4, 9, white knight to a4, black bishop takes pawn on c5, 10, white knight takes bishop on c5, black queen to a5 check, 11, white bishop to d2, black queen takes knight on c5, return to diagram A again. There were yet 2 more moves that you might have chosen in this highly interesting position. 8. White pawn to e3 blocks in the queen's bishop and deserves nothing. 8. White queen to b3 is more complicated, but also does not score. Black can reply 8. Black bishop takes knight in f3. 9. White bishop takes bishop on f3. Black knight takes pawn on d4. 10. White queen takes pawn on b7. Black knight takes bishop on f3 check. 11. White pawn takes bishop on f3. Black queen to e7 check, with the exchange of queens and easy equality for black. Return to diagram A and set up the pieces as shown. After Erver's 8, white knight to e5, Stoltz replied with a sharp 8, Black pawn takes pawn on d4. Now switch off and try to guess white's next move. White played 9. Knight takes bishop on g4. 2 points for this equally sharp reply. The only alternative worth considering was 9. White knight takes knight on c6. So after 9, black pawn takes knight on c6. 10. White queen takes pawn on d4. Black can be reasonably happy with his position after 10. Black bishop to e7. One rather generous bonus point is yours if you played this line. Return to diagram A, adding the moves. Knight to e5. Black pawn takes pawn on d4. And knight takes bishop on g4. It was important here that you consider the line 9. Black knight takes knight on g4. 10. White knight takes pawn on d5. And now black knight to f6. If you have not seen this line, switch off now and decide how you might refute it. The refutation is 11. White bishop to g5, with 2 possibilities for black. He may try black bishop to e7, but then white wins the pawn with much the better position by 12. White knight takes bishop on e7. Black queen takes knight on e7. 13. White bishop takes knight on c6 check. Black pawn takes bishop on c6. 14. White queen takes pawn on d4. Replace the white queen on d1, the white bishop on g2, and the white knight on d5. Move the black pawn from c6 to b7. Replace the black pawn on d4, the black knight on c6, the black queen on d8, and the bishop on f8. The alternative for black would be queen to a5 check, but white can reply 12, white bishop to d2, black queen to d8, 13, white knight on d5 takes knight on f6 check, black queen takes knight on f6, 14, white queen to b3. Here, white has terrific pressure on the queen's side. If black, for instance, castles queens, then white rook to c1, followed by white queen to a4, should win quickly. Take 3 bonus points if you saw all this before playing white knight takes bishop on g4. 2 points if you got it on your second chance. Return to diagram A, adding the moves white knight to e5, black pawn takes pawn on d4, and white knight takes bishop on g4. Switch off if you need time to do this. On his 9th move, black took the knight on c3 with his pawn. White replied with the forced 10. White knight takes knight on f6 check. And black retook the knight with his queen. Now switch off and guess white's next move. White played 11. Pawn takes pawn on c3. 1 point. Black was threatening to win a piece by 11. Pawn takes pawn on b2. So your answer was virtually forced. The only other move to gain a point is 11. White queen to b3, which offers some prospects down the b file. If in choosing 11, white pawn takes pawn on c3, you considered a little piece of cleverness by black, to wit 11, black bishop to b4, and decided that after 12 castles, black bishop takes pawn on c3, 13, white rook to b1, you would win either the d or the b pawn, take a bonus point. Replace the white rooks on a1 and h1, the white king on e1, and the white pawn on c3. Replace the black bishop on f8. Black would here have been well advised to complete his development by black bishop to c5, also attacking f2. Instead, he took the profit pawn on c3 with his queen, giving check. Switch off and guess white's next move. White's 12th move was bishop to d2, 1 point. Deduct 6 points for 12, white king to f1, which unnecessarily loses a whole rook. Note that if black's queen now retreated to c5 or e5, white would castle and threaten to win the d-pawn with either bishop to e3 or bishop to f4, depending upon how the black queen was positioned. Black in fact retreated the queen back to f6 on his 12th move. Switch off and guess white's reply. White played 13 castles. 2 points. 1 point each for 13 white rook to c1 or white rook to b1. The king has got to be got into safety, so why not do it now? One move you should definitely not play is 13. White bishop takes pawn on d5. After black rook to d8, 14, white pawn to e4, black bishop to c5, threatening maze, 15, white castles, black castles, black threatens to bring his knight to d4 or e5, putting pressure on white's weak square, f3. Deduct 2 points if you grab the d-pawn. Return to diagram B and play castles for white. Black rather greedily hung on to the d-pawn by 13, rook to d8. Guess white's next move. White played 14, queen to b3. 2 points again for this move. White hits both the d and b pawns. 1 point only for 14, white rook to b1. Stoltz, again greedy, or maybe feeling that he should keep some material compensation for his definite positional disadvantage, protected the b-pawn by black pawn to b6. This was, however, his last chance to avoid a major catastrophe. Black had to play bishop to c5, aiming to get some development. If you had not considered this move before, switch off and work out how white should reply. The game might go 15, white queen takes pawn on b7, black castles, 16, white rook on a1 to c1, black rook to b8, 17, white queen to a6, black bishop to b6, 18, white bishop to f4, with white maintaining the better position because of the two bishops and the weakness of the black d-pawn. White's only problem is to avoid tactical tricks which black might produce. For instance, in the last line, if instead of 18, bishop to f4, white had snatched the d-pawn, then black knight to e5, threatening black bishop takes pawn on f2 check, would be rather nasty. Take 3 bonus points if you considered this line, along with 14, white queen to b3. 2 bonus points if you got it after prompting. Return to diagram C and set up the pieces as shown. Switch off and guess white's next move. White played 15, bishop to c3. Take 4 points for this excellent move. White proceeds to take advantage of black's laggardly development. Black's last move did in fact set another trap. If you again had grabbed the d-pawn, deduct 2 points. 15, white bishop takes pawn on d5, is answered by 15, black knight to d4, 16, white queen to e3 check, 16, white queen to a4 check, or 16, white queen to c4, are answered by black pawn to d5. After 16, white queen to e3 check, then black bishop to e7, 17, white bishop to b3, black castles, black is entirely freed of his difficulties. Return to diagram C and set up the pieces as shown. (15) White bishop to c3 finally dispenses with the threat of black knight to d4. 15, black pawn to d4 is answered by 16, white queen to b5, and on black rook to d6, white has 17, bishop takes pawn on d4. Two bonus points if you considered this line. Return to diagram C and play white bishop to c3. On his 15th move, black moved his attacked queen to g6. Switch off and guess white's next move. White took the pawn on d5 with his bishop. At last this move is safe. Take 1 point for it. White's two bishops have tremendous power in this open position, and black has yet to castle. You may wish to switch off and just examine the position for a few moments. Stolz now avoided the threat of white queen to b5 by playing 16, bishop to c5. Switch off and guess white's continuation. White played 17, bishop takes knight on c6 check, and in reply to black queen takes bishop on c6, took the pawn on g7 with his bishop. 2 points for this idea, which prevents black from castling. Set up the pieces as in diagram D. Point 17, white bishop takes pawn on g7, which is quite strong. After 17, black queen takes bishop on g7. 18, white bishop takes knight on c6 check. The opposite coloured bishops should aid the white attack. Any other move which allows black to castle does not deserve any credit. Return to diagram D and play white bishop takes knight on c6 check. Black queen takes bishop on c6. And white bishop takes pawn on g7. Black played 18, rook to g8. Stop and try to guess white's next. White moved 19, queen to c3, 2 points. An important move which enables the white queen to eye the black squared weaknesses of the black camp. No score for any retreat by the white bishop. The move played aims to take the square f6, which controls the square d8, which in turn holds the key to who will control the queen file. Take 2 points for 19, queen to b2, played with the same ideas. Stolz now moved his queen to attack the white e-pawn by 19, queen to e6. Switch off and guess white's next move. White played 20, rook on a1 to d1. For this exactly calculated move, take 3 points. Moves such as white bishop to f6 and white bishop to e5 are met respectively by black rook to d6 and black rook to d5. 20, white pawn to e3, intending white bishop to d4, deserves 1 point. 20, white rook on f1 to d1 gets you nothing, however. Black can then take the pawn on e2 with his queen. 21, white rook to e1, then being answered by 21, black bishop takes pawn on f2 check. 22, white king to h1, black bishop takes rook on e1. 23, white rook takes bishop on e1, black rook to d1, which draws at the very least for black. Set up the pieces as shown in diagram E. Stolz, in characteristically daring fashion, grabbed a very hot pawn by 20. black rook takes rook on d1, and after the forced 21, white rook takes rook on d1. Played black queen takes pawn on e2. Switch off and guess white's next move. White played 22, rook to d2. This is the reputation of black's extravagant play. Take 3 points if you saw it, and a further 2 bonus points if you intended it when playing rook on a1 to d1. Deduct 6 points for playing 22 rook to e1, which loses ignominiously to black bishop takes pawn on f2 check. Set up the pieces as in diagram F. Switch off if necessary. After the game move 22, black bishop takes pawn on f2 check, loses to 23, white king to g2, black queen to g4, 24, white queen to c6 check. Go back to diagram F. 22, black queen to e6, also loses to 23, white bishop to f6, black bishop to e7, 24, white rook to e2. A rather pretty line this. If black takes the rook, 25, white queen to c8 check, will mate him next move. Take a bonus point for each of these variations. Moves such as 22, white queen to e5 check, and 22, white rook to f1 merely relinquish the initiative, and therefore do not deserve any credit. Set up the pieces as in diagram F. Switch off if necessary. Black took the only course open to him here, and checked with the queen on e1. White played the forced king to g2. There are a number of bonus points to be gained here. If when playing 22, white rook d2, you calculated that 23, black queen to e4 check, 24, white pawn to f3, black queen to e3, black can't go queen to e6, as 25, white queen to d3 wins. 25, white bishop to f6, black queen to g1 check, not of course queen takes queen, which allows mating 1. 26, white king to h3, black queen to f1 check, 27, white king to h4 wins. Take 2 points for this. Return to diagram F, adding the moves black queen to e1 check and white king to g2. Not liking this denouement, black played 23, rook takes bishop on g7, which is making the best of a bad job. Switch off and try to guess white's next move. There should have been no difficulty here. White took the opportunity of winning the black queen and played 24, rook to d8 check. Black replied by taking the rook, and white captured the queen on e1. 1 point if you saw this sequence. Nothing for any other continuation which you may have discovered. On his 25th move, Black played rook to g6. Switch off and try to discover White's next move. White played 26, queen to e4. 2 points for this, and for 26, queen to e5. Both of these moves win a pawn. Actually, Black was unable to save the pawn anyway. Return the queen to e1 and the rook to g7. In this position, Black could have played 25, pawn to a5, which requires one more move to set up a solid pawn position with Black king to c8. Unfortunately, White has the riposte 26, queen to e5, which wins a valuable pawn. For example, 26, Black rook to g6, 27, White queen to h8 check, or 26, Black bishop to f8, 27, White queen to b8 check. 2 points for seeing this possibility when playing 24, White rook to d8 check. 2 further points if you plan this as far back as 22, White rook to d2. You certainly are a star. Without the win of a pawn, the ending would still be difficult for White. Return to diagram F. Remove the White rook and bishop, and place the White queen on e4 and the White king on g2. Place the Black rook on g6, the Black king on d8, and remove the Black queen entirely from the board. Black correctly decided to deny White a passed h-pawn. He played Black pawn to h6. Switch off and guess the continuation chosen by White. One point if you decided upon the sequence 27, White queen to a8 check, Black king to e7, 28, White queen takes pawn on a7 check, winning a pawn. Black now chose king to f8 to bring his king over to protect the weak king side. Switch off and try to guess White's next move. White played 29, pawn to a4, with the immediate threat of pawn to a5, the pawn being immune from capture because Black's bishop would then be en prise. Moreover, if Black leaves the pawn, it will advance to a6 and eventually to the 8th rank. Take a point for this move. Black parried White pawn to a5 by playing his bishop to b4. Now switch off and work out White's next move. Also formulate the general strategical plan you would use to win this ending. A simple advance of the White kingside pawns would seem to put the Black king in lots of trouble. In fact, after hinting at this plan, Ovid chooses to utilize the second, rather more subtle string to his bow, namely that of transferring his king over to the queen side, and at the appropriate moment giving up his queen for the Black rook and bishop, thereby simplifying down into a one king and pawn ending. This is only the general outline, of course. Take 2 points if you merely intended a general advance of the White pawns, supported by the king. If you realize that this could be linked with the transference of the king to the queen side, take a further 2 points. As a preliminary to the grand plan, White centralized his queen by 30, white queen to b8 check, black king to g7, and 31 white queen to e5 check. 2 points for this sequence. The white queen was out of play at a7, so this maneuver immediately suggests itself. Black answers a second check by moving his king to g8. Switch off and guess white's next move. White played 32, pawn to f4. 2 points. When the pawn has been advanced another square, the black rook will no longer be able to oscillate between e6 and g6, where it is guided by the black pawn on f7. Take 2 points if you chose to move the pawn to f4 on either of the last 2 moves. It is an essential component of white's plan, and the actual point at which it is played is not desperately important. Black played 32, rook to e6. Switch off and try to guess white's next move. White played 33, queen to b5. 2 points. Clearly the best move. It attacks the black b-pawn, which henceforth has to be protected, and denies the square e2 to the black rook. There is the added point that if black ever plays bishop to c5, white can win immediately by pawn to a5. Black now retreated his attacked bishop to f8, whereupon white continued the plan with 34, pawn to f5. Black moved his rook to d6. Switch off and guess white's next move. White played 35, king to f3. 2 points. An extra one if you intended to move the king to h5 via g4, and then advance the kingside pawns to g4, h4, and eventually g5. In the ending, the king should be an aggressive piece, so the immediate g4 only gains 1 point. In order to stop the plan outlined in the last note, black played 35, rook to d4. Switch off and guess white's reply. White played his king to e3 on the 36th move. Again, Irva rightly decided not to commit his pawn forward without the attendance of his king. Instead, he decides to swing his king across the board to capture the black b-pawn without losing his a-pawn. 2 points for this idea, which has already been hinted at. An extra point if you noted that the seemingly strong 36, black bishop to c5, loses to 37, white queen to e8 check, black king to g7, white queen to e5 check, followed by white queen takes rook on d4, transposing into a 1 king and pawn ending. Set up the pieces in diagram G. Switch off if necessary. Black next moved his threatened rook to b4. Switch off and guess white's reply. White played 37, queen to e8, 2 points. White must continue to guard his a-pawn. 1 point for queen to c6, or queen to d7. The move played has the added advantage of pinning the black bishop. Black unpinned by 37, king to g7. Switch off and guess white's continuation. White pursued the transfer of his king by 38, king to d3, to which black replied 38, king to g8. There is in fact no constructive plan for him. White then played 39, king to c3, intending to win outright by 40. White queen takes bishop on f8 check. 1 point each for these last two moves by white. Return the white king to e3 and the black king to g7. In this position, another winning possibility was 38, white pawn to f6 check, black king to g8, followed by the gradual advance of the king's side pawns. This would mean the return of the white king to the king's side, which would not be consistent with the plan Irva has mapped out. Still, objectivity requires that you get 2 points if this was your idea. Return the white pawn to f5 and the king to c3. Black moved his rook to g4 on his 39th move. Switch off and guess white's next move. White played 40, queen to b5, attacking the b pawn. A tricky move if you haven't fathomed Irva's plan. White intends simply king to b3 and queen takes pawn on b6, whilst black rook to b4 check leads always to a winning king and pawn ending. Return the white queen to e8. Nothing for the impetuous 40, white king to b3. When white is driven back by rook to b4 check. Return the white queen to b5 and the black rook to g4. Place the white king on c3. Stoltz played 40, black bishop to c5, setting one last trap. Switch off and guess white's reply. White played 41, king to b3, 3 points. Deduct 3 points, however, for 41, white pawn to a5, which throws the win away. Black would reply, black bishop to b4 check, and after 42, white queen takes bishop on b4, black rook takes queen on b4, 43, white king takes rook on b4, black pawn takes pawn on a5 check, 44, white king takes pawn on a5. The white king must rush across to the king's side and will do well to draw. Return to diagram H and play white king to b3. Of course, if black now plays rook to b4 check, the pieces are exchanged, but the pawns on the queen's side remain. Black had one other alternative, which we should have looked at, namely 41, black bishop to d4. Switch off now and consider how you would play against this move, always assuming you have not looked at it already. 1 point for seeing 42, white pawn to f6, threatening white queen to e8 check. If black then goes 42, king to h7, 43, white queen to d3 check, black king to g8, 44, white queen to e2, threatens queen takes rook on g4, and queen to e8 check. Return to diagram H and play white king to b3. Black went king to g7. Switch off and guess white's last move. Over finished the game prettily by 42, white pawn to a5. 2 points, but only if you saw the complete continuation. 42, black rook to b4 check. 43, white queen takes rook on b4. Black bishop takes queen on b4. 44, pawn to a6, bringing white a new queen for the one he has just sacrificed. Now add up your points. This game should have tested you in all departments, so a good score is especially meritorious. If you handled the white king and queen with the economy and expertise of Irva in the ending, there may well be great days ahead for you. End of game 2.
Get the Grandmaster norm. Game 4. In Game 4, you have the white pieces. Your partner is Mark Taimanes, a leading Soviet Grandmaster and renowned theoretician. Your opponent is Gennady Kuzmin, a young Soviet Grandmaster who numbers among his tournament successes a shared first place in the English Christmas tournament at Hastings. The game was played at the Soviet Championship in December 1975. The opening was the Minza Indian defense to the Queen's pawn. The opening moves were 1. White pawn to d4, black knight to f6, white pawn to c4, black pawn to e6, white knight to c3. And now by bishop to knight 5, black pinned white's knight, thereby preventing white going pawn to e4. The alternative move to get some control of the centre was pawn to b5 for black, but restraining the white pawn centre by pieces rather than by pawn play is one of the hallmarks of the modern game. This game continued. White pawn to e3, black pawn to b6, and now white knight moved from g1 to e2. This is a rather unusual placing for the knight. One might have expected it to go to f3, but in this position white is aiming to guard his knight on c3, so that when, if black captures, white will be able to capture with a knight and thus avoid getting the liability of doubled pawns. And in this sort of opening, the doubled pawns that white might get can be quite a liability. Now, in reply to white's knight to e2, Black developed his bishop, but not on b7. He played bishop to a6, attacking the white c-pawn. Now switch off and guess white's sixth move. White played 6, pawn to a3. 2 points for this move. This way he'll be able to move his king's knight without allowing the doubling of the c-pawns. If now black retreats his bishop to e7, then white can continue either knight to g3 or knight to f4. This latter move, knight to f4, being perhaps slightly preferable, since the knight bears down on the d5 square. Now return to diagram A, reset the pieces if you move them. If instead of pawn to a3 you played knight to g3, that also gains 2 points. It's quite a popular continuation. 1 point if you chose knight to f4, and 1 point again if you chose pawn to b3, or even white queen to b3. All these moves have slight disadvantages. The first 2 moves allow black knight into e4, and the third commits the white queen before it's certain where that piece is needed. Now return again to diagram A. White played pawn to a3, as we said, and in reply black played bishop takes knight on c3 check. Switch off and guess white's reply. Well, that's an easy one to give you confidence. White replied knight takes bishop on c3. Deduct 2 points though if you played pawn takes bishop on c3, which loses the c-pawn. Now in order to counteract white's threat of pawn to e4, black played pawn to d5. Switch off again and guess white's reply. White played 8, pawn to b3. A move designed to maintain the white pawn center. There are a few other moves which you might have chosen instead. You might have chosen pawn takes on d5 instead of pawn to d3. But then black could go bishop takes bishop on f1. And after white recaptures with the king, it's difficult to imagine where white can obtain an advantage to compensate for his loss of castling rights. Now, if you move the pieces, return to diagram A again, and just take the white knight on e2 off the board, and the black bishop on b4 off the board. Play white pawn to a3, and black pawn to d5. Now, if you chose in this position pawn to b4, that's a tricky move. You don't get any points, however. This move, pawn to b4, was actually played in a game, Ritov versus Timon, and that went black bishop takes pawn on c4 because white is threatening pawn to b5, so black has to make a decision. White plays bishop takes bishop, and black plays pawn takes bishop. Here I'd have expected white to go queen to e2 to try and recover his bishop pawn, but perhaps he was worried about black's reply pawn to a5, so instead of queen to e2, white played rook to b1. Now black castled, and white did play queen to e2. You might like to switch off here and just study the position for a little. In this position, black came up with an unusual move. He played pawn to b5 to guard his c-pawn. White played knight takes that pawn, and now black played queen to d5, hitting the knight and hitting the g-pawn. However, you might have noticed that white can now take on c7. Let's just have a look and see what would happen if white did that. White plays knight takes on c7, black queen takes on g2, hitting white's rook, and now white rook to f1. Right, so switch off again. What would you do here? I think the best idea for black here is to go knight to d5. Then, if white captures the rook on a8, black can play knight to c3, and he is also forking. He forks the queen and rook. And whereas if white plays knight takes knight, black can just go queen takes knight, and he's got a very nice looking position. White's king's rather in danger. And if white plays queen takes pawn on c4, that's instead of knight takes knight, I think black can go rook c8, and that could be very nasty for white too. So let's go back to the game. That's why you didn't get any points if you chose pawn to b4. Return to diagram A. Remove the white knight from e2, the black bishop from b4, and play pawn to a3 and pawn to d5 for black. Pawn to a3 for white, of course. Another move you might have chosen was bishop to d2, though it isn't worth a point. It's true that black can't as yet win the pawn on c4 because of a queen check on a4, but on the other hand, the bishop on d2 hasn't got much future. So return the bishop to c1. Another possibility in this position, and one which gets you 2 points, is to play queen to f3. That also guards the c-pawn indirectly, because the black rook on a8 would be en prise if black captured on c4. Another idea behind the move is that if black castles here, white can play the enterprising pawn move, pawn to g4, intending to advance to g5 and win the d-pawn, as well as expanding on the king's side and beginning an attack perhaps. Now let's go back, return the white pawn to g2, white queen back to d1, and the black king and rook to e8 and h8 respectively, and play white pawn to b3 as occurred in the game. Black's eighth move was castles. Switch off and guess white's reply. White played bishop to e2. 2 points for this natural developing move. 1 point for bishop to b2 or bishop to d3. On d3 the bishop has got less options, though it is more aggressively posted. It can't be too easily deployed on the h1 a8 diagonal, which it might do from e2 by going to f3 sometime. And also it's liable to be hit by black playing pawn takes on c4, and that restricts white's option. He may want to do a Zwischenzug in certain positions. Nothing again if you played bishop to d2, and I think that's all the moves you might have considered. Now in reply to bishop to e2, black played knight to c6. Switch off again and guess white's next move. White played pawn to a4. Take 3 points for this move. 2 points if you played it last move. White must take time out from the development of his pieces to guard against black's threat, which is pawn takes pawn on c4, white pawn takes pawn, and black knight to a5. That's black's idea. In this position, let's replace those pieces. Put the black knight on c6, black pawn on d5, white pawn on c4, white pawn on b3. Right, in this position, if black played pawn takes on c4, white could move bishop to a3. Again, a Zwischenzug, attacking the rook, which would have to move. Black rook to e8. Then white could go pawn to b4, and he's threatening to go pawn to b5, and then he can recapture with bishop takes on c4. Quite a nice looking position. Now if instead of pawn to a4 you played a move like white bishop to b2 or castles, and allowed black to play pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, then knight to a5, you wouldn't get any points. It's true you could still guard the white pawn on c4 by going queen to a4, but then black could either go queen to d7, or he could go knight to e8 to d6, putting a lot more pressure on that c pawn. So return to diagram B and set up the pieces as shown. Black, in reply to white's pawn to a4, went rook to e8. Switch off and guess white's reply. White played bishop to b2. 2 points for this move, and also 2 points for castles, which is the other natural developing move you might have chosen. 1 point for bishop to a3, which may help white to play pawn to b4 in some lines. Black's reply to bishop to b2 was pawn takes pawn on c4. Switch off and guess white's reply. White retook with the pawn on c4. 1 point for this natural recapture. Now replace the black pawn on d5 and the white pawn on b3. Now, if after pawn takes pawn on c4 you retook with the bishop, you don't gain a point, because black can play bishop takes bishop, pawn takes bishop, knight to a5, white queen to e2, and now black queen to d7, and he's threatening to play queen to c6, and it's hard for you to defend your white squares, and particularly that white pawn on c4. Now return again to diagram B. Switch off if necessary. Play from that diagram black rook to e8, white bishop to b2, black pawn takes on c4, and white pawn takes on c4. Black's 12th move was knight to a5. Switch off and guess white's next move. White answered the threat to his c-pawn by going knight to b5. And after black pawn to c6, driving the knight away, knight went to a3. Take 2 points if you got this idea. It was one of the points behind pawn to a4. Take a bonus point, therefore, if you played that pawn move with this curious knight maneuver in your mind. No points if you answered black's knight to a5 with pawn to c5, and deduct 2 points if you overlooked the fact that the c-pawn was on prise. Now after white's knight to a3, black moved queen to e7. Now switch off and guess white's reply, and also discuss how white might continue the middle game. On this 15th move, white finally castled. 2 points for this. An extra point if you realize that if black continues developing with, say, rook a8 to d8, then white will play queen to c2, centralize his queen's rook, and prepare to expand in the center by pawn to f3, pawn to e4. Black's counterplay by pawn to c5 can always be met by white moving knight to b5. Now reset the pieces as in diagram C. Switch off if you have to. Play castles kingside for white. Black in this position could have played queen to b4. And in response to white's natural move queen to c2, he doesn't go queen to b3, which probably would lead to a slight endgame advantage to white. But instead of queen to b3, black can try knight to e4. Switch off here and consider this position if you haven't already analyzed it. Position is certainly a tricky one. Perhaps white's best here is bishop to d3. When black goes knight to d2, white will go bishop c3. After white's bishop to d3, I consider pawn to f5 as probably the best line for black. The alternative knight to d6 may not be too good. White may capture on h7, though that is unclear, but also white may play bishop to c3, trying to trap the black queen. Black goes queen to b3, and then white can go queen to c1. And now there's a threat of bishop to c2, trapping the queen, because if the queen plays queen takes bishop, then bishop takes h7 check wins it. So 3 points if your analysis went something like this. It's unlikely to have gone exactly the same. And 2 points if you work these things out at your second opportunity. As I said, after white's bishop to d3, probably black has to go pawn to f5. Position isn't entirely clear. Now let's return the pieces to diagram C and play castles for white. Instead of the sharp move queen to b4, Kuzmin continued with an even more tactical move, pawn to e5. This imaginative move can be met by equally imaginative play from white, and the following stage of the game will require careful thought. Now switch off and guess white's next move. White played pawn takes pawn on e5, more or less forced. You get 2 points for that. Other moves would only justify black in his thrust. Black played knight to d7, switch off again, and work out white's move. White played pawn to f4. 1 point. The e-pawn was 3 times attacked, and this move is the only way to defend it. Nothing for any move which allows black to capture the e-pawn with his knight. Then he would have quite a good position, especially as he would be bearing down on white's weak c-pawn. Kuzmin now played a move which must have been in his mind when he played pawn to e5. He attacked the white pawn center by pawn to f6. Switch off and guess white's move. White played 18 rook to f3. Take 5 points if you chose this excellent move. White intends to combine the action of the bishop on b2 and the rook on g3 to create strong pressure on g7. Now replace the white rook on f1. Deduct 1 point if you chose pawn takes pawn on f6, which would justify black's last move. He could reply knight takes pawn on f6, but probably better queen takes pawn on e3 check, immediately regaining his pawn. And there'll be a great scope for the black pieces after that. Now we set the pieces as in diagram D. You may have chosen, instead of rook f3, queen to d6. You get 3 points if the idea was to answer black's pawn takes pawn by rook on a1 to d1. Now if black continues laconically with rook on a8 to d8, guarding his knight, white just plays queen takes queen, black rook takes queen, and then bishop takes pawn, and black can't play knight takes bishop because his knight's pinned. Now return again to diagram D. Now, let's look again at queen to d6. Black plays pawn takes pawn, white rook on a1 to d1, and as far as I can see, black's best chance is probably go knight to c5. and he's at least going to maintain material equality by picking up white's A pawn. But white will of course get the E pawn. Right, so let's go back to the game, return to diagram D, and play white rook to F3. Black's reply was pawn takes pawn, and white went rook to G3, as we mentioned. Kuzbin now decided he better feed some of his pieces across to the king's side. Played the rather dubious-looking knight to B7. This knight also intends to stop white's main threat of queen to C2 and bishop to D3 by going to C5. Switch off and guess white's next move here. White immediately seized on the fact that black had left his c-pawn undefended, and also white's c-pawn unattacked, by going bishop to f3. You get 3 points for this move. You get 1 point if you tried bishop to h5 instead of bishop to f3. The intention is later to go queen to g4 with certain attacking chances, though it may end up that white's pieces get a bit entangled with each other on the king's side. So let's replace white's bishop back on f3, and in reply to bishop to f3, black played rook to c8. Wasn't much else he could do. Sorry, rook a8 to c8. Now, switch off and guess white's next move. Here another white piece launched itself into action, went knight to b5. You get 4 points for this move, 2 points if you played it last move. The move has now got added force due to the fact that black's a pawn is undefended. Actually, white isn't here threatening to go into d6, you might notice, because black's knight on b7 at least guards that square. White's main threat is to play knight takes on a7. Naturally, black can never go pawn to e4, because that would mean that white would play rook takes on g7 check. Instead of knight to b5, you might have chosen queen to c2 or queen to d2, both of them not bad, but less incisive than knight to b5. After knight to b5, black had to capture the knight, so you play pawn takes knight, switch off again, and decide on your next move. White recaptured the black pawn on b5 with his a pawn. Take 1 point for this obvious move. White's now open up the a file for his rook, so that's 2 pieces on the queen's side which have suddenly begun to have an active say in the game. If you took with the c pawn, you don't get any points. It's clearly not as good as taking with the a pawn. Now black here could have answered pawn takes pawn by knight to c5. If you hadn't considered this move, switch off and decide how you'd play as white in this position. White could continue bishop to d5 check, knight into h8, and then pawn takes bishop on a6. Unfortunately, he's got to close the a file, but he's still got a very good game with the two bishops really sweeping across the board. And there hasn't got much you can do in this position except where you can take this position will be able to hold out. One of the steps, by the way, is to go to h3 and then take on h7 check and then to h5, which is going to be mate. So 2 points for this idea. That is playing bishop d5 check pawn takes and so on. And only 1 point if you got it on your second turn. Now please reset the pieces as in diagram E. Prisoner now tries to counter-attack. He didn't want to play knight c5, he played knight to d6. Switch off and guess white's next move. White played rook takes bishop. 1 point. This is the only move which scores. Since the back bishop was going back to a7, next move had to be taken. And clearly better to take with the rook because that would have more activity. Black's 23rd move was knight to f5. Switch off and guess white's reply here. Black's knight on f5 attacks the white rook on d3, but white ignored this by going rook takes on a7. You get 2 points for this move, but nothing for anything else. Clearly, if black plays knight takes rook now, white can play rook takes knight on d7, and then he's going to recapture the knight on d3, giving himself a clear advantage. Well, in reply to white rook takes pawn on a7, Prisoner played his last trump. He played pawn takes pawn on f4. Switch off and guess white's next move. White once again played almost the only move. Rook takes pawn on g7 check. Take 4 points if you got this move. Now replace the white rook on g3 and the black pawn on g7. If white chooses any other move, he lands in trouble. Let's look at this trouble. If white plays rook takes knight on d7, you'll have to deduct 4 points if he shows that. Black plays queen takes pawn on e3 check. White king to f1. Obviously, if he goes to h1, black's going to mate on the back rank. So white king to f1. Black's pawn takes rook on g3. Now, let's replace some pieces again. White rook back to a7. Put the other white rook on g3. Let's see the white pawns now. White pawn on e3 and a white king on g1. Put a black pawn on f4, black queen on e7, and a black knight on d7. Now deduct 2 points if you chose queen to d5, check for white. Black will go king to h8, and white hasn't got time for queen takes on f5, because if black queen takes on e3 check, and a mate follows shortly. Now replace the white queen on d1 and put the white rook on g7 as he played in the game. in g3. Yeah? Replace the black king on g8. Put black's queen back on e7. Black's knight back on f5. And the white pawn on e3. So white has played rook takes pawn on g7 check, and black has to recapture. He played knight takes rook. Now switch off and guess white's next move. White now took the knight on d7. Rook takes knight. So this is in effect being an exchange sacrifice. Rook takes knight on d7. 1 point for this move. The only other way to recapture this knight was to play queen takes knight on d7, but you'll have to deduct 4 points if you chose that move, because black would have made him 2 moves by queen takes pawn check again. So white actually played rook takes knight on d7, and black played queen takes pawn on e3 check. White replied king to f1. I don't imagine he would have chosen king to h1. And this is the crucial position you had to visualize when you played rook takes pawn on g7 check. If you'd intended to answer black's knight to e6 here by queen to c2 or queen to b1, you get 2 bonus points. Both moves threaten mate on h7, and there's no satisfactory defense. If you were intending to play bishop to d5 against knight to e6, you'll get 1 point, because that's quite a strong move as well. White threatens queen to g4 check for a start. Now, return to diagram F and set up the pieces as shown. In the actual game, black defended against the attack on g7 by playing rook to e7. Switch off and guess white's next move. White played rook to d3 here. This is the only move again. 4 points if you spotted it. You gain a further point if you plan to refute black's knight to f5 here, which hopes for white rook takes queen, black knight takes queen check. Now if you intended to play against knight to f5, rook to d8 check, black rook takes rook, white queen takes rook check, black king to f7, white bishop to h5 check, black king to e6, white queen to d5 is mate. So bonus point if you were intending something like this. Now return to diagram F. Play black rook to e7. Now Taimanov pointed out in his analyses that bishop to d5 check wouldn't have won. Let's have a look at that. Bishop to d5 check, king to f8, bishop takes knight on g7 check, black rook takes bishop, white rook takes rook, black king takes rook, and now white can pick up a rook by queen to g4 check. Black can go king to h6 though. And now if white takes the rook, queen takes rook, black can get himself a perpetual check by going queen to d3 check. So No point for bishop to d5 check, no point for any other move either. Now return to diagram F and play black rook to e7, answered by white rook to d3. After white rook to d3, black played the forced queen to c5. No other squares for that queen. Goes back to e6 to return and win it. Switch off and guess white's reply. White played bishop to a3. And in reply to black queen to g5, bishop takes on e7 with his bishop. 2 points for recovering the exchange in this way. White's still got his extra pawn and a marvellous advantage in position. Black played queen takes bishop on e7, switch off and guess white's next move. White came in again, rook to d7, 2 points here. It's obviously correct to seize the 7th rank, place the rook in a dominating position. But if you chose bishop to d5 check, following up by queen to e2, hoping for a better endgame, you'll get 1 point. Now after white's rook to d7, so let's have white bishop back on f3, white queen back on e2, on d1, sorry. Black moves his second queen to f6. Switch off, guess white's reply. White went queen to d4. Very strong move because it guards the c-pawn and puts out of action black's only piece which can cause white any problems, that is the black queen. White queen to d4 gets 2 points. Now, after black queen takes queen, if black plays queen takes queen, he's got no chance of effective check ever, and white will recapture rook takes queen. Now black's f-pawn is going to go. Black rook to f8, white rook comes into d6, black rook to b8, white rook to f6, and here if black plays rook to f8, bishop d5 check is too strong. So white's going to win another pawn with an easily won endgame. Now let's put the pieces back. Black queen on f6, white queen on d4, black rook should be on c8, and white should have his rook on d7. White's got his bishop on f3, black is king on g8. So, after queen to d4, black had to go back, queen to f8. Switch off, guess white's last move in this game. White played bishop to d5 check. Not a move you should have missed. However, you'll only gain 3 points for it if you realize why Kuzmin chose to resign in answer to this check. Switch off now and try to get the answer if black's resignation came as a surprise to you. The point is, after king to h8, white rook to f7, black queen has to go to g8, otherwise it's mate on g7. Then white will play rook to c7, discovering an attack on the white queen, on the black queen. That queen has to go back, queen to f8, and now comes the coup de grace. Queen takes knight on g7 check. Black queen takes queen, white rook takes rook on c8 check, and black hasn't got any pieces left. So take 2 points if you got this on your second bite at the cherry. 3 points if you saw it all when you played bishop's d5 check. Now add up your points. That's the end of game 4.